going to illustrate a few outcomes and a few thinkers as kind of signposts in this history, which I'm going to try to show that there are some patterns. That's, as an economics historian, that's what I do. I look for patterns, and then I'll just quickly summarize the facts at the end. The timer isn't working, so that's dangerous. I might be going over. Anyway, at least you have booze. You'll just have to wait for the food. So I'm going to start with this text, which was written by a Roman jurist in the 2nd century AD. He was a high official in the Roman Empire. And he was, this is a commentary on some law, and he was trying to talk about the legal aspects of purchase and sale. And, there's a buyer, there's a seller, and whether you're one or the other makes a difference from the legal point of view. And he says, yeah, but it wasn't always that way, and we didn't always have money. Rather, every man bartered what was useless to him for that which was useful according to the exigencies of his current needs. For it often happens that what one man has in plenty, another lacks. But since it does not always and easily happen that when you had something which I wanted, I, for my part, had something that you were willing to accept, lack of double coincidence of wants, this is where it gets interesting. A material was selected, a passive voice, which being given, again, passive voice, a public and stable value, avoided the problems of barter by providing a constancy of quantity. This material struck with a public imprint provides use and ownership less from its substance than from its quantity. So by quantity, you probably have to think of the coins, the number of coins that there are. Nor are both things called merchandise, but one is the price. So why is this text interesting? Because it ended up being part of the legal tradition of Western Europe. In the 6th century AD, Justinian compiled lots of legal texts, and this one was one of the texts that was preserved. And it's a text that many people thought about over time, and it framed the understanding of money. So as I said, initially Paulus was just trying to distinguish between the symmetric barter situation from the asymmetric buyer and seller. But it's a foundational text. First of all, it's the first statement of the double coincidence of wants, and as you saw, very clearly and crisply presented. And it highlights the dual nature of money. There's both something profoundly natural about it. That's there's this problem, and that's an obvious solution. But there's also something artificial or constructed about it. That's where the passive voice was coming in. It was selected. A form was given. The word public appears twice. So it's both a natural thing and a social thing. And money in the early Middle Ages and early modern period actually reflected this dual nature. On the one hand, money consisted of coins, so gold, silver, material objects, and the size, the specifications of those were determined by the sovereign. There are no numbers attached to these coins, by the way. Nothing was written on it. The value was in terms of some reference coin. But it was not inscribed on the coin. So that's the physical side. But then the social construct appears in the fact that the accounts were kept in units, and liabilities were denominated in these units of account. And what was a unit of account? It was a reference to one of the specific coins that was, or maybe used to be in circulation, but it wasn't anymore. So the unit of account was the penny, say. The penny originally was a coin that circulated. Maybe it still circulated, but it was an abstract reference to that coin. So when I'm talking about monetary policy in such ancient times, what am I thinking of? Well, there was some monetary policy. You could change the contents of a coin. That was called a debasement if you're reducing the contents of the coin. You could change the price that the mint paid for metal. So you would be changing the seigniorage rate, or basically the monopoly tax that the government levied to make coins. Or you could modify the face value, the value assigned in reference to some coin. So this is not, quarterly fine-tuning of deciding we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But there were decisions that needed to be made at various times to make up for depreciation of coinage. I'll talk about that, to prevent outflows, or sometimes to, raise revenues, use the inflation tax. So the doctrine that was elaborated in time. In the background, they're civil lawyers. They're really only focused about debt repayment, and their view is you shouldn't harm the creditors. So they have a very hard money view of things. They look through the unit of account, the social construct aspect. They look through to the substance, and they say, if you lent X amount of gold, you should get back that same X amount of gold. The church lawyers, for a historical accident, actually think about public policy, and the reason is it's kind of an incident, but there's a king who had come to the throne. He swore to uphold the currency, and then after his accession, he realized that the currency had been debased shortly before by his father. But now he's sworn an oath to uphold his bad coinage. So what do you do in those days? You write to the Pope. You say, "Dear Pope, here's my pickle. Can you get me out of it?" And the Pope says, "Yes, well, it's an oath, so we have to take this seriously. But since the coin was bad, you're allowed to not uphold it and go back to the original coinage." And then the church lawyers, so that became part of the law of the church, and said, "Well, what was wrong about that coin? What's wrong about debasing a coin?" And so over the course of a few decades, very rapidly, they elaborated a doctrine. They admitted that the right to make coins belonged to the sovereign. That was a tradition inherited from the Roman law, from the Roman Empire. But money serves a common purpose. And so the sovereign can't just do anything he wants with it, because, as Aristotle said, it measures all things. And as Proverbs says, diverse weights, diverse measures are not a good idea. So it measures all and should not change without consent. And here it's an interesting aspect of church law. They reused an element of Roman law to manage trusteeships or tutorships. That which affects everyone requires the consent of everyone. So there was this idea that, well, maybe under some circumstances you can muck around with the currency, but you should do that with the consent of everyone. There were exceptions that were allowed, and these exceptions accumulated over time. Little moderate seigniorage, that was okay to cover the production costs of making the coins. Legitimate emergencies were okay, but in principle, you were supposed to require consent. And in the 15th century, they added this interesting notion that if you do that, you can issue bad coinage or really crappy coinage, but afterwards you have to buy it back, basically. You have to make whole the people to whom you gave the coins, or the people who hold the coins at the time the emergency ends, actually. So a few examples of thinkers along this path. The guys on the left, the context is on the right. The context is a graph showing the number of units of account per fixed amount of silver over time. So if it goes up, it means there's less silver in the coin. It means the coin is depreciating, or it's commensurate to the price level. So if it goes up, it's like the price level. There's two countries here, England and France. England is red, France is blue. So two things. Both of them have if you really squint at it, you filter the heck out of it. There's a long run trend for these two, and roughly the same for the two countries. And you see these little jumps occasionally. I'll get back to those. And also make a mental note of the red dot, somewhere around 1695. The other thing you notice is, apart from that trend, there's these crazy swings. Now, as you probably know, for a good chunk of this graph, the two countries are at war with each other, because England is convinced that it owns France, and France begs to differ. So that goes on for 100 years. And these really crazy swings with the French, those coincide with periods of wartime. So these are debasements. It's a log scale, by the way. So, we're talking serious manipulations. Nicole Orem, who's on the left, was a cleric. He was trained in church law. He was steeped in these ideas that I talked about. But he was also an advisor to the King of France, who was very enlightened, right in that period, or right after the big first burst of debasements. And he talked about in very subtle ways about essentially the effect of inflation on nominal contracts, why it was bad. This explained that the prince's gain was the community's loss, but it was grounded in this notion that money is a tool that belongs to everyone, and you can't muck around with it even when you're being invaded by the English. So this is pretty strong hard money. There's another fellow in that tradition, a Spaniard, a Jesuit. Now, his context is a little different. The Spaniards had just discovered fiat money printed on copper instead of paper, but it's basically fiat money. And they started printing a lot of it. And he's writing in 1609. So the graph shows you the nominal and the real balances of this stuff that are going up over time, and then crazy things happen afterwards. But he's writing when the two lines, nominal and real, coincide. So there's not much depreciation or not much inflation yet. But he's saying, guys, it's coming and it's going to be bad. And he's really has very, very harsh words for creating this fiat money. It's displaced silver. It's like a tax. You're taking away the properties of your subjects. You're not allowed to do that, not without their consent. And he did say, there are some benefits from having this kind of inflation, and there's a very interesting analysis of foreign trade and so forth. But he says, on balance, as a good economist, the costs outweigh the benefits. And he also notes very pointedly, when bad things happen, people in power get blamed. And he's talking to the King of Spain. He did run into trouble with the Spanish Inquisition, I have to admit. Now, before I get to the third character here, I have to explain what his context was. It has to do about recoinages. One problem with physical coins of gold and silver is that, well, that depreciates over time by wear, the coins wear. And I have some obscure work on this, estimating it can, year by year, it's not huge, but over decades or centuries, it can accumulate to pretty significant amounts. So you end up with a population of coins. Some are new, some are old, some are worn, some are not worn. You don't have a single clean standard anymore. And if there's a deficit, a trade deficit that you have to settle by shipping metal out, of course, the heavy coins are going to go out first. So the average weight decreases over time. The exchange rate depreciates. People get upset. At some point, you have to do something. Natural thing to do is either you debase, that is, the new coins that henceforth you will add to the stock are of the average level of the ones out there, or you recall all the coins and you make them new again. But then there's a question on what standard do you do that? So either you go back to the old standard, but then the coins are worn, they're missing 10%, so the 10% you're going to have to find it from somewhere. Or else you say, well, bygones are bygones. The coins have depreciated. The new standard, the new coins are going to be at the 90% of what it used to be. So in one case, the cost is on the bondholders. In the other case, it's either on the money holders who will have to come up with a difference, or else the government comes up with a difference, which means the taxpayers. So these conflicts, bondholders or taxpayers, that's a very old story. In fact, in 1622, Naples was in one of those situations really, really bad. And the local government had decided, well, we're going to debase. And then the King of Spain heard about it. He says, that's out of the question. I'm a hard money kind of person. Curiously, at the same time, he's doing this copper stuff. But anyway, he says, no, you have to recoin at the old standard. Initially, he said that cost is going to be borne by the money holders. That didn't work out, especially because some of the money holders were banks and they were going to go bankrupt. And they're going to be a systemic crisis. So they ended up with a complicated formula where the depositors were bailed in. There was also local taxes raised and a tax on foreigners. Because after all, their debt had been revalued. So it was only fair that they should contribute to the costs. Similar situation shows up 7 years later in England. So that's the picture on the left, on the right, which shows the price of a guinea, a constant amount of gold in terms of local silver currency. And you can see that by the 1690s, it suddenly starts going up very sharply. So it's a similar situation. The coins are clipped, are worn. It's terrible. Recoinage is needed. We're going to do it with a new technology, so the new coins are going to be much better. And John Locke is advising the parliament because there are some people in parliament saying, let bygones be bygones, let's devalue by 20%. So the cost won't be borne by anyone, well, except the bondholders. And that's what the people in parliament were advocating. And Locke was really against that, furiously against that. Contracts are sacred. And we just had a glorious revolution. We can't start fooling around with property rights at this point. I'm putting words in his mouth. But the words that follow are from him. Men in their bargains contract not for denomination or sounds, but for the intrinsic value, which is the quantity of silver that the public authority has said should be in the coins. So in the name of that social contract, we cannot modify that social construct because that would be violating contracts. So that's what the recoinage was done at government expense, that is at taxpayers' expense, which ended up being 65% of annual revenues in the year 1695 in the middle of a European war. So extremely costly. I'll just briefly mention, things change. So we get out of the Middle Ages. There are some innovations that are going to change somewhat the terms of what does it mean to have price stability. Paper money. Jurors discover that, paper money is okay. Marco Polo tells us people over there on the other side of the world do it. And the Neapolitan banks actually start having circulating pieces of paper. And the law also changes. The big case in England is the so-called mixed monies case. There's a French jurist. The doctrine changes fairly abruptly, saying basically, the government can decide what does a dollar mean. Then they can do it overnight if they want. That's their right. And now we have the prototypes of central banks that start appearing. Some of them have ledger money. Some of them have circulating notes. The basic point is now it becomes possible to disconnect the substance and the unit of account much more easily. You just stop converting or suspend convertibility. Does it change the prescriptions? Not very much. You still have this notion, and John Locke, I think, was very influential in creating this culture of sound money that persisted into the 19th century. You still have this notion of emergency suspensions. You have some crazy people like John Law that Mike mentioned who say, hey, with this new invention, we can actually do very fancy stuff, but that didn't turn out terribly well for him. So that's what happened with him. That's the value of his pieces of paper. Over the course of a few months, they fell from 100% to just a few percent. So that kind of get a bad name to fooling around with paper money. So here's a kind of a summary of European experience in the 18th and 19th century. What was the experience? This is plotting basically the exchange rate relative to, for England, it's the value of the currency in terms of gold. And then for all the others, I use the exchange rate from those countries to England and then convert it to gold. So basically, how does your currency compare to gold? And there's a variety of experiences. But what's interesting is even the best of the class, the top left, a flat line means price stability, but you have these deviations. And again, the scale is the same. If it goes up, it means that you have a depreciation. So they, of course, and they have been mentioned over the course of the conferences. Great Britain, suspension during the Napoleonic Wars. U.S., the greenbacks during the Civil War. France, it's a very nice flat line with an unfortunate episode there in the 1790s during the French Revolution, where I've had to move to a log scale. And then you look at the others, it varies, but a lot of them, they try to stick to relatively flat lines, so price stability. Italy is in the middle right panel. Before unification, it's pretty flat. After unification, doesn't hold very well. And then the bottom of the class is at the bottom, which is various, what do I have? Yeah, Spain, Portugal, and the worst are Austria, Russia, and Sweden, who started experimenting with banknotes very early on, from the mid 18th century. As you can see, their experiences are somewhat painful, but they're striving. Everybody's striving to get back to a stable standard. Austria is the more pitiful story. They spent the whole 19th century trying to get back onto the gold standard. And every now and then they get, there's a revolution in 1848. There's a war with Italy in 1859. There's a war with Prussia in 1866. So it takes them forever to get, but eventually by the end of the 19th century, they get on the gold standard. So, the gold standard, which is sound money, it's kind of the norm for the good countries. The periphery, they have a harder time, although their experience shows that it's possible to shadow the gold standard. And so there's this notion that it's okay, it's okay to deviate from the gold standard under exceptional circumstances, and that's something that Mike Bordo a long time ago with Finkinland called the state contingent gold standard. But kind of my point is this has a very long history as a principle. That's 1914. Again, an index of the value of the currency for a whole collection of countries after World War I. So it started in 1919. That was a really, really big event. So very few countries were able to make up and get back to the earlier standard, although famously Great Britain did in the 1920s. The two interesting facts here are, one, there's a huge diversity of experiences, again, log scale. So that's in order to fit Germany and Russia and so forth. Although whether you were winner or loser, which is indicated by the colors, is not a perfect predictor of whether you had a bad experience or not. In fact, some of the interesting cases are the Baltic states or Czechoslovakia. But the second point is, after a few years, everybody tries to get back on a flat line. So in the 1920s, there's still the objective of price stability. Of course, as we know, after 1929, things are very different. I'm going to skip over the 20th century in the interest of time, and because that's where my comparative advantage diminishes. That is, I can't fool you as easily. I'll just throw that picture that everyone's familiar with, but cast in kind of the same framework as the previous pictures. So this is price levels in various advanced countries, normalized to December 2019. With the odd exception of Japan, it kind of looks the same. The slope goes up, steepens for a while, and then it flattens again. And, the range of impact on the price level is between 15 and 25%. I did, just for fun, this is a scatter plot of for a whole bunch of countries. On the vertical axis is how the increase in the price level over the course of 4 years from 2019 to 2023. On the horizontal axis is an index of central bank independence. That clearly doesn't tell you very much. This is a picture I stole from the paper that Robert talked about, but was too shy to present to us. But if you look at government spending on the horizontal axis and inflation on the vertical axis, it lines much more. That's it. What do I take out of this? The price stability objective has a very long history, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. In practice, it meant, in monetary dominance, but not absolutely strict adherence at all times. And of course, as John Cochrane reminded us yet again, monetary dominance has very strong fiscal underpinnings. Somebody has to come up with the dough. It usually included these escape clauses, the state contingent gold standard. But the key question is, okay, you're allowed to deviate. Do you go back to the original standard, or do you go back to stability, but not necessarily, make up? Do you have a make-up strategy or not? When the deviations are huge, like Germany, there's no point in trying to do a make-up strategy. But from these large deviations, there can be serious distributional consequences. So, in that perspective, the shock that we just had, looks big by great moderation standards, but by the standards of history, it's not really that big. And some of the questions that were raised during the conference were, was this allowed under the escape clause, or was this a serious deviation? There was no makeup, and we've just discussed that in the last panel. But as John mentioned with the pitchforks, there can be political consequences. That's it. Thank you very much.
We take one or two questions. Okay. Andy and Jim. Oh, Jim. Okay.
Jim Bullard, Purdue. So, as I understood it, the Pope played a key role in this. Would it have mattered if the Pope was American, do you think?
If he had been a Cubs fan, probably it would have been it would have been much better. But
So coincidentally, my question's related. So I had the honor of writing a paper with Michael Bordo about 10 years ago, more or less. We started it, and we actually had the quote that you have from Julius Paulus. It was the opening quote of our paper on digital currencies. And the only reason I mention it is because Julius Paulus was given the honorific Prudentissimus, which roughly would be translated as most prudent or most wise, most sage, because he actually was ended up providing a lot of the legal advice of the Roman Empire at the time. And so I was thinking maybe the Pope could give that award to John Taylor. The honorific of Prudentissimus. So,
all right.
That was fascinating. Could you say something about the assignats? You have the diagram there of the French Revolution. What I find very interesting is that, if I understand correctly, Robespierre ended up being kaput because of the combination of hyperinflation and price controls. So, could you clarify what's?
No, he died before the hyperinflation.
Okay, so could you tell us a little bit about the assignats, which is
so the very short story is three periods. Period one, this paper money is backed by land instead of being backed by gold, but it's fully backed, works nicely, doesn't depreciate. Scene two, France stupidly goes to war with the rest of Europe, and tax revenues are collapsing. The only resource they have is printing money, but it soon depreciate. So they say it's what Tom and I call the guillotine-backed regime, where you're going to have to accept that piece of paper, otherwise, and so that's under Robespierre, and that works for a while. But Robespierre is overthrown for a host of reasons, not so much that aspect, I think. And then the day after he dies, there's a police report saying two things are happening. The currency is starting to depreciate, and prostitutes have come back on the streets. And then we get to hyperinflation after that, but it's afterwards. Yeah. So once the restrictions are removed, once the threat of legal action, because he was a very stern man.
Oh, I will. Okay, well, we got to get to dinner,
Right.
John Hartley there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I think A Chronicle of Deflation Unforetold is probably one of my favorite papers of all time. It's a paper by François. I'm curious. That paper's largely about monetary non-neutrality. I'm curious, sort of in this whole span of history that you cover, what do you think, or what have you learned about monetary neutrality, non-neutrality in these instances? And at what point does monetary policy take on, I guess, a more benevolent nature, whether it is some sort of a perceived maybe dual mandate or and other trade-offs going on? I'm curious where that fits in.
No, so the episode in question relied on the fact that in France you didn't have denominations written on the coins, and it fits in this story because there had been deviations from price stability in the previous years, and John Law in particular, and after that the government felt a need to go back to the earlier level in line with this tradition that you have to make up for things, and they named explicitly the fact that the bondholders had seen their debt devalued, and they wanted to make it up to them. So they wanted to change the price level, and they thought that this is going to be a piece of cake. The coins that are worth 6, we just announced that now they're worth 3, and we're done. And they thought, it might take a week, 2 weeks, maybe at most, and they discovered monetary non-neutrality, and so that was eventually, Hume read about this story and talked about it. I don't see it feeding back to discussions of what's the right standard. Although, I mean, after the suspension of convertibility by the Bank of England in the 1810s, there were debates about whether do we have to make up or not. Do we have to return to the old standard? And there were some cranks who said, no, you shouldn't. It's going to be deflationary. And they weren't taken seriously. There's also debate after the Civil War, over the terms of the resumption, whether you should go back completely or not. So that you see these questions of the effects of the redistributional effects starting to play into the political debate. And then in terms of when do people start thinking in terms of a dual mandate, or the two, I'd say that's more of a 20th century thing. Now, why that changed, that's political economy stories.
Let's get Hoyt, an economic historian back there.
Yeah, I don't want to keep people from their food. Yeah, that was stuff.
Thanks. So the phrase "coin of the realm," I suppose, is something I'd never thought of until you said this. That you gave this presentation. Now, often this is backed with the state being somewhat aggressive in making sure that there is a coin of the realm. But how often was there a relaxation of that? That there was tolerance of other monetary instruments, maybe even an endorsement of that, of competition amongst different regions?
That varies a lot. Well, it depends on how big you are. If you're a small little city state, it's kind of hard to keep the foreign coins outside. But say very roughly, medieval tends to be fairly tolerant, and then but 6th, 17th, 18th century is when you see countries usually starting to prohibit foreign coins. Before then, 15th, 16th century, sometimes you actually have official values for the foreign coins. You have long lists of foreign coins and what they're to be taken at. But it's it's a nation state kind of thing, I would say.
I think we should slate barrel. Wait, yeah.
So after the Napoleonic Wars, there was the question about going back on the gold standard in the UK, and it was David Ricardo who took the lead in Parliament, particularly arguing to go back at the previous parity. But was that kind of the first example of that when that occurred in 1821 or whatever it was?
Of what? Of returning or of debating the question?
Of returning.
Oh no, there were. I mean, there were many. Yeah, there are other examples. This wasn't the first time by a long shot. This may be one of the times. No, actually, I mean the Neapolitan example, 1622. There's public debates about what should we do? Should we return to the old standard or not? And the costs involved and things like that. So,
I think we should thank Dr.